Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy, but America's agricultural landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertisement campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. Kyle Bauer and the Real Ag crew bring you truthful, unbiased information about real agricultural concerns. From the producers who make your food, to the store where you buy the final product, and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Now, here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
The majority of the people in the United States eat meat. We must raise animals to provide food. But how can we determine if these animals are being raised humanely? Animal welfare is our topic today on Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
They sound similar, but animal welfare and animal rights are two different philosophies.
I think animal welfare just has a lot to do with the producer's interaction with the pigs or whatever animal they're raising, and how they treat the animal, what they provide the animal with in terms of food and water, and giving the animal their basic needs, so that they can live out their days not under duress. It's different from animal rights, which it has to do a lot with people's belief that animals have the same rights as humans, and of course that a lot of times leads to people believing that animals should not be used for food consumption. So that's a big difference between animal welfare and animal rights, because I think almost all of the producers, well really all of the producers that I work with are animal welfareists. I mean, they always try to do what's best for the animal, but that doesn't necessarily make us animal rightists, because ultimately we are raising animals for food to feed a hungry world, and we know what the end result is going to be, but we're trying to get the animals there in the most humane way possible.
Animal welfare, as we view it here in the Beef Cattle Institute, is doing the chores. It's feeding the livestock every day, caring for them, helping them if there's a dystocia. It's basically caring for the animal from conception to harvest.
By far and away, the majority of producers want to do what's right for the animal welfare of the animals that they're raising. Just like any group, we have some maybe bad apples, and whether that be that they're not educated, which we are working to try to fix, or they're just not good at what they do, or they're not passionate about what they do. I mean, just like any, there's bad teachers and there's bad parents, and but by far and away, I think most teachers and most parents and most producers, want to do what's right.
In the beef cattle industry, we passionately care about these cattle. They're our livelihood. Having grown up on a ranch, feeding the livestock comes first. You worry about eating supper after the chores are done of an evening.
Producers want to keep healthy animals, but why?
If we have healthy animals, is the first step in assuring that we have a safe, wholesome product in the meat market in the grocery store. If we can manage animals via nutrition, whether it's protein and energy and trace minerals, and we can have that immune system working properly, then we don't have to use the amount of antibiotics that we would have to use if we didn't have the right trace minerals, or if those animals were stressed. Any stress will obviously make those animals sick. We have to use antibiotics. So if we can keep that animal healthy, again, from conception to harvest, then we don't have to use the antibiotics.
Aside from an ethical incentive, there are economical advantages to keeping livestock healthy.
Yeah, I think one of the common misconceptions is that, producers aren't animal welfareists, or that maybe some people think that producers don't care, but I think it's really quite the opposite of that, because in almost all cases, it's in the producer's best interest to maximize the animal's welfare, because then the animal produces better for them. So, it's a win-win when you look at it that way.
If we aren't feeding them properly, if we aren't providing shelter, if we aren't trying to reduce stress, they don't perform right, and they aren't profitable, and you can't be in the business if you aren't profitable.
How do you know if an animal is healthy?
When we're talking about the science of animal welfare, like as I mentioned earlier, that it really is an ongoing process, but it's probably one of the more difficult sciences, because when we're looking for, let's say, an example, we're doing nutrition research, and we want to know, which particular diet makes the animal grow better or grow more efficiently. That's easy to measure. Well, okay, it's black and white anyway. It's not easy because you have to measure feed and you have to weigh the pigs, and it's a lot of work, but it's pretty black and white. They either grew better or they didn't grow better. Welfare, on the other hand, is a lot harder to measure, because what are you asking? Are you asking, is this pig's quality of life better, or is this pig happier? How do we measure that? We can't really ask the pig. So that again causes some controversy, because some schools of thought is that we measure their production, and obviously the ones that are the most productive are also going to have the best animal welfare. And some people argue that that's not necessarily true. Just because they grew better didn't mean they were happier or less stressed, or so that is part of the controversy of this kind of research. And many people have tried different methods. They've said, well, we're going to measure the cortisol level in the animals, because just like in people, as the animal's stress goes up, their cortisol levels go up. So we're going to, during the process of this trial, we're going to take blood samples from the animal and measure their cortisol levels. Well, for one thing, animals aren't as cooperative as people, so you can't just say, I need to draw this blood from your neck just so that we can do this trial, and it'll only hurt for a little bit. They don't really understand that. So just the process of drawing the blood is stressful itself. So it makes for maybe more in the gray area, a little less in the black and white when you're doing this kind of research. But I don't want people to get discouraged, because we have made great strides in how we handle the animals, and what the ideal situation is in terms of whether it be housing or their temperature, or how much feeder space, what the water flow is. I mean, we have great ways to measure their environment, which we didn't have when they were out in the mud hole next to the red gable roof barn. Animal behavioralists, they've been around for a long time, but I think they've just gotten a little more notoriety, and more universities have animal behavioralists on staff, just because of the issues that arise, whether it's helping producers with answering animal behavior questions, or also I think when they do animal research, they always want to have an animal behavioralist involved to make sure that everything that they're doing in terms of the animal research is done in a humane, welfare-friendly manner. And so that's another job of an animal behavioralist.
Let's talk about animal welfare as it applies to beef.
The big stressors in the beef cattle industry, castration, dehorning, transportation, weaning are probably our big four. And a lot of times, those usually occur in the first 6 to 8 months of that calf's life. We are currently working on projects where we are evaluating low stress weaning, or fence line weaning, so to where these calves are acclimated before they're weaned, and so the weaning process itself isn't as stressful as it used to be, just the abrupt removal. We're encouraging producers to use polled genetics so they don't have to dehorn. We eliminate a stressor. We encourage people to castrate the male calves at an earlier age just because it reduces stress if we do it when they're 2 months old versus when they're 8 or 9 months old. A lot of the cattle in the U.S. are raised in what we refer to as a general term, the Southeast, or the Deep South, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Virginia, the Carolinas, Arkansas. But those cattle then are transported to the Great Plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Nebraska. Once they're weaned, they're transported out here to be fed because it's more economical and easier to transport the cattle to the feed rather than the feed to the cattle. Transportation is inherent to the beef cattle industry, but we need to prepare those cattle for shipment, have them weaned before they're shipped so they handle the truck ride better. Part of the Beef Quality Assurance Program, BQA, was started in the mid-1980s because of a residue problem in a feed yard in Oklahoma, but that is morphed into, we've dealt with the residue issue that started that. We continually monitor cattle to make sure that we don't have residues. We follow withdrawal guidelines. We make sure that we give injections properly, and that has, in the last few years, again morphed into what we call animal welfare audits, where we audit conditions in the feed yard or on the ranch in the cow herd to make sure that we have good equipment, that there's not a piece of pipe sticking out in the working facilities that's going to injure cattle as they go through. We're going to make sure that the water tanks are clean. We're going to make sure that the feed bunks are in good repair. We're going to have protocols that encourage early castration, that encourage planning ahead. Under the audit system, if animals are not treated properly, if a feed yard, for example, doesn't pass its third-party audit, an audit done by an independent contractor, then that feed yard cannot sell to the packing plant and ultimately to the food service industry or the grocery store industry until they correct that deficiency. Now, these are many times a voluntary, they get started as a voluntary program, but then they evolve into these audits must be done if you're going to sell your product.
Let's talk about animal welfare as it specifically applies to pork.
I think one of the controversial issues in pork production today is that the general public they have their vision of, old McDonald's farm where every farm has 2 pigs and they spend their time in the mud wallow, next to the big red barn. And, that's all nice and looks great in the kids' picture books, but, that's not the reality of today, because the fact of the matter is those pigs had to suffer through, ice and sunburn and, all the extremes of the weather. And so that wasn't necessarily good for them, even though we kind of want to remember it as being good. So the modern production takes that factor out. You know, we do raise pigs in confinement, and there's some great advantages to that, because then we can control their environment so they're not too cold and they're not too hot. And we take them away from the dirt where they're exposed to parasites, which of course aren't good for them and ultimately not good for us if we're raising them for food. So there are a lot of things that we can control. We can control the amount of food that they eat, so we don't have anybody that's raised pigs in a group knows there's always one big bossy sow that goes around and you know, torments all the rest of them and gets more than her fair share of feed. And by having them in confinement in individual feeding situations, we can control those kinds of things. So it's maybe not as, you know, picturesque as some people remember, but it's a much more, I guess, a much fairer way for the individual pigs to be raised. Modern hog production, moving into confinement systems, has just made the productivity grow exponentially. You know, in the olden days, you know, you were lucky if you got 2 litters a year out of a sow, and you know, she might wean 8 pigs, or you know, now we're consistently weaning 11.5 or so pigs per litter, and we're getting you know, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 litters a year. So you multiply that out, that's a lot of pigs. And then also, if you consider with modern production and feeding systems, we're able to take a pig to like a 280-pound market weight in 5 months. And you know, before it was 7 or 8 months to get that pig to maybe 240. So you know, you multiply those numbers out, and that's a lot of pounds of pork. But when we're, you know, over 7 billion people in the world to feed, and we're moving to 9 rapidly, that's what it's going to take, because we're going to have to be able to, you know, do more with less, and that's what modern hog production is really about. I mean, we're trying to raise food for a growing world with as few of resources as possible and leaving as little of a footprint as possible. Some of that comes through breeding programs, you know, where we have a lot more ability for data collection. For example, we use computers on the farms. You know, we measure pigs by weighing them. We measure their back fat. We measure their, you know, their loin-eye areas, and then we use that for genetic selection to pick the most efficient pigs. Pork Quality Assurance Program was actually developed by the National Pork Board, and started, I believe, in 1989 is when they rolled out the program, and it was really designed for self-policing by the producers in the pork industry. And probably much to everyone's surprise, but it was a great thing, is that it caught on. The producers liked it, and maybe even more importantly, that was a time when the pork industry in the U.S. was tipping from a net importer to a net exporter. And that was probably a major factor in that, because international pork buyers were impressed by the program. They were impressed with the producers' willingness to voluntarily join the program. And part of there are really 2 main focuses. One is food safety. And so that is, you know, what can pork producers do in their operations in order to ensure consumers that their food is safe, you know, whether that be from diseases or antibiotic residue or, you know, physical, you know, foreign bodies in the meat, or any of those types of things. And then the second part of it is the animal well-being, and that is trying to educate the producers on, you know, how pigs should be handled and what the right environmental temperatures, the spacing of the pigs, what, you know, how pigs should be moved and transported in order to minimize stress. And so I really like that aspect. That was a kind of a later addition in the program, and that part has, you know, really grown. And I enjoy when I go to farms and put on pork quality assurance programs for farm workers. I probably get more questions in the animal well-being part, because that's what they do every day, and they want to do a good job. I mean, we're just trying to provide them the tools and the answers to their questions. I think when you have somebody that maybe isn't passionate about animal welfare, it depends on the system that they're in. Most vertically integrated companies, which I mean companies that maybe own and raise the pigs, and maybe own the slaughter plant, and maybe own further processing plants, so they're involved in pork production all the way along. Most of those companies have pretty strict animal welfare policies, and the ones that I've worked with, they have a no tolerance policy. So if people are not following the animal welfare guidelines that they've been taught, then they will be terminated from their jobs. In smaller, family-owned operations where you're dealing with a lot smaller numbers, and maybe they don't have a CEO and they don't have a animal welfare person on staff, then their main resources a lot of times are the pork quality assurance guidelines that we give them, or people like myself, veterinarians that work with them on the farms to try to improve those situations. The ones that I've been involved with, if they have a bad egg, a person that's working for them that doesn't take good care of the animals, when they become aware of it, then that person is, usually either terminated from the job, or they're given the option to change or be terminated. And it, again, basically boils down to, do they not know or do they not care? If they don't know, let's educate them. And if they don't care, they don't need to be raising pigs.
Producers aren't just guessing when it comes to the health of their animals. There's a lot of science involved.
Here at Kansas State, we have a research feedlot that's the animal science department has, where they're doing studies with cattle, replicated or duplicated studies, so we can determine if they are relevant. A
big question of who's in charge of animal welfare, and who sets the parameters, and that's actually an ongoing controversy, I guess, because the producers, and for the most part the veterinarians, especially the swine veterinarians, believe that the answers to those questions should be rooted in science. I mean, we should be able to look at scientific data and decide, how many feeders do we need in a pen. We should be able to tell, how much space is adequate for optimal growth of the pig. And so, you have the school of thought that science should be the main measuring stick, but then you have animal rights groups. They have a different belief, and it goes back to the animal rights, where they believe that the animal should have the same rights as people, and that you can't measure the animal's happiness using science. And so there's quite a bit of controversy, I guess, in that area. The National Pork Board's Pork Quality Assurance Program has chosen, theirs is based on science. Any hard parameters that they have in there are, for numbers that they're giving for the guidelines are based in science. That's where they're getting it.
A big part of animal welfare is selecting the right animals for breeding. How do genetics apply to animal welfare?
Our heifers are young cows, if you will, that are coming with their first calf. Typically, we use what we refer to as a low birth weight or calving-ease bull. It will be a lighter calf. It's usually a little different muscle pattern, not a real big boned calf, not a big headed calf, but it'll be a bull that we use bulls that have been selected because we know that they will sire a lighter calf. Growth performance probably isn't is good in that calf, but we get a live calf and we don't injure the heifer. Then as they get older, we can use heavier birth weight bulls where we're not worried so much about calving ease. Those mature cows can calve on their own, and we get a little growthier calf. We get a different type of calf out of that cow.
It's science. You're going to have to continually look at the data, and sometimes we may not choose the right path, and so then we have to recognize that, back up and try again. And examples of that is we might have animals that are too aggressive, and that causes tail biting issues. So we want to make sure that we're monitoring not only the specific criteria that we're pushing for, but what else happens. Maybe we get more umbilical hernias, for example. So those are the kinds of criteria that we're just constantly looking at, and if by putting pressure in one area, we develop a problem in another area, we have to be honest and say, okay, back up. Let's try it a different way. And we've been doing that for years, and we've come a long, long way. I think production is much better, now than it was 25, 30 years ago.
The field of animal welfare continues to change and improve every day. There are more debates to have, techniques to improve, and changes to make. For the Real Ag crew, I'm Kyle Bauer, and this has been Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
The Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.